Resuming debate?
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Great Resuming Debate podcast. I'm your host, Member of Parliament Garnet Jennis. We are going to be releasing this episode on Remembrance Day. So I want to start off the top by thanking those who did serve, and especially recognizing the sacrifices of those who never came back and of their families. It's an important day for our country. And for those of us who serve in politics, to remember that it is not from us that freedom comes; it is from the sacrifices of those who fought and died, and their families as well. War is always a tragedy, and at the same time, I believe very much that defensive war is sometimes necessary for the defense of the innocent and the protection of fundamental human rights. We hope that as much as possible we can pursue a course as policymakers that leads to both more peace and more justice and security. So aligning with this day and fittingly, our topic is on peace and war. We're in a time where the world is changing. It sort of feels cliche to say the world is changing. The world is always changing, but there are some particular immediate changes that I think are worth reflecting on as a few powerful actors are trying to shape existing trends in different directions. A part of this is that peace seems to be breaking out in some places, and yet conflict stubbornly persists in others. I'm really pleased to be joined by Balkan Devlen from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a professor, foreign policy analyst, who's going to talk us through some of these events. Balkan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Garnet.
So yeah, just off the top, let's talk about the state of the world. And in that context, some of the recent peace initiatives. Donald Trump has played a role in peace deals that we've seen in the Middle East and Central Africa, in the Caucasus, involving Armenia and Azerbaijan. I wonder if you could share how you'd evaluate the efforts of the Trump administration to mediate ends to longstanding conflicts. And why do you think these efforts have been successful in some of the cases that I've mentioned?
I think there are two things on this one. Number one, with a lot of things in life, it also comes to timing. When we look at sort of broader conflicts, particularly conflicts that lasted for years or decades, there seems to be a sort of a golden hour opportunity when both sides seem to be either exhausted or one side tend to have a decisive victory, and then you end up having a peace agreement as a result. In a number of these conflicts, I think this is about the timing component of it. But the second one is, of course, the way the Trump administration engages with some of these actors. Transactionalism, as we tend to sort of highlight the way the Trump administration works with other countries, can be seen as in a negative light. But when it comes to engaging peace negotiations, it can be seen as a much more honest way of engaging, basically sort of trying to force a bargaining space between two partners, and someone who is used to making such deals is more effective. There's a third component too, though, and in that case, President Trump sometimes like to claim credit when things are after done, and then he can come in and claim the credit for it. And in some of these cases, that's the true. I would say that the most, I think, reasonable one to see a Trump administration push it would be the one in the Caucasus between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Which of course followed a war and decades of conflict in the region. But there, I think it was very clear that the push from the Trump administration to bring those two parties together to be able to sign up to something. It's not necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily sort of reflect on the same way for some of the other conflicts. But it is a combination of being in the right time, in the right place, as well as a particular mindset that really sort of sees this bargaining issue as a bargaining rather than taking one side or the other.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So you've got to be both in the right place at the right time and uh, approach it in the right way. Tell me more about your comments on transactionalism. So just to deconstruct this a little bit. So a lot of us come to foreign policy with with a moral lens, right? We want to ask what is right, what is just in the context of this conflict. Who started the fighting? Whose land should it be? Whatever the case may be. But another way of looking at it is a kind of morally neutral transactionalism, where you say, okay, regardless of those questions of right or wrong, what do both sides want? What is in both sides' interest? Who's willing to compromise, or who's being forced to compromise, and how can we expedite this process of uh, of transactional deal making? And um, it's obvious why the moral lens is appealing to many of us. But what you're suggesting is that maybe that transactionalism is a bit simpler because it doesn't invite us to um, uh, explore grand moral questions. It just says, how do we get to a deal?
I mean, I think the way you lay out is perfectly accurate in the way that these things work. But I think when one needs to sort of let me start with a full disclosure. I do believe that our interests are downstream from our values, right?
Yes, I totally
Um,
agree.
right, like even the most basic things we define as national interests, such as political sovereignty, is about valuing that sovereignty, that the right to rule ourselves without foreign interference and a foreign yoke, which is a value rather than a material objective reality. So interests are downstream from values. So even when you engage with a transactional, what seems from outside a transactional foreign policy, those have implicit values that are embedded into that transactional structure. And historically speaking, when we look at the bargaining way of thinking about the war, there's a whole academic literature on treating war as a mechanism for bargaining. Um, we also tend to see that stable, durable peace agreements are generally based on a firm foundation of justice and moral rights, rather than whatever is expedient at the moment to end the bloodshed. But even there, you are engaging in a moral trade-off. Is it better to have a stop right now, which may turn out to be much worse in the long term because it can restart or it can create longer lasting injustices and suffering, rather than a continuation of war, which may end up being shortening that suffering in the long term. But these are all very hard moral questions and judgments, and that's why we tend to sort of approach international politics. At least I tend to approach as a way of thinking about this as a tragedy. There are always trade-offs, and in most cases, you're trying to make a trade-off between bad and worse, not a perfect good. So there are inherent, I would say, problems of transactionalism. Of course, transactionalism. This is also self-interest component too. Bargains tend to stick when there is something for both sides to be able to hold on to it. If it is just the one-shot game where we just agree today, but in 6 months I'm going to break it because there is no firm grounding of that among the populace, among the political leadership of both parties or more, we will restart that whole thing. So although in the short term, a transactional way of thinking about, let's just end the killing, may look appealing and may look to some people more moral because you're ending the killing, that may or may not be necessarily true. And that's where you have a proper statesman uh, is someone who, when you look at Aristotle, talks about phronesis, practical judgment, practical wisdom,
Yeah.
being able to take into account the long-term consequences of the actions and make those trade-offs. So there is no real easy answer, and we
Yeah.
only end up seeing whatever at the end.
Yeah. I mean, I think the point you're making there is really important, that even with it's not just transactionalism versus idealism. There's also the question of judgment within both. You can be an idealist and you either have the wrong ideals or fail to apply those ideals in a way that's effective in the real world. You can also have transactionalism that is done effectively or not effectively. And I mean, we're going to talk mainly about the contemporary world, but it's interesting drawing on history. Sort of, I mean, a lot is made of the contrast between the Congress of Vienna and the Versailles Settlement as 2 points of ending kind of great European wars. Um, uh, the Versailles, the Congress of Vienna was at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, very pragmatic, recognizing kind of the role that France would continue to play as a great power, even though it had been the belligerent in this terrible series of conflicts. On the other hand, the Versailles treaty that was much more informed by certain ideals around justice. And for some people, it's easy to say, well, that's why we should be more transactional and less idealistic. But I think a more precise point is to say that Versailles failed its own test in many ways. It was not it was idealistic in moments, but very transactional in other moments, and it pursued certain kinds of ideals, but it did not pursue other kinds of ideals, and so it's not good enough to pick a side, either transactionalist or idealistic. You also have to actually know what you're talking about and be good at it.
Yeah, and again, pragmatism and transactionalism is a moral choice.
Yes.
It is you are making a value judgment there, so it is not an objective thing that you are having a 30,000 feet look and make the proper mathematical judgment, but you are trading certain things versus the other one. So there is an
Yeah.
inevitable trade off there. So at least when you are approaching with a very clear-eyed moral perspective, you are making it explicit what you're basing your judgments are. Most people who advocate for a more transactional, pragmatist foreign policy just basically sort of actually sort of hid that moral set of judgments and values behind the notion of objectivity. So I think it's important to sort of recognize
Yeah.
that there are times for to be pragmatic and there are times to be for idealistic, and all that has to be actually driven by a very core set of what do we value for, and therefore what our interests are.
Yeah. So in terms of peace as the objective, right? We're talking about achieving peace. There's short-term peace and there's long-term peace. And the point you made earlier is that a just peace, uh, a peace that can lead to former belligerents seeing themselves again as part of a common human community and having developing a sense of shared solidarity and trading with each other and these sorts of things. That is. That kind of those long-term conditions of peace are more likely to come out of a just peace, a peace that is not only kind of imposed as a result of transactional imperatives, but also comes as a result of a sense of common community. But you might also hope that um, if you can just stop the shooting, if you can just stop the killing for a while, that may create the conditions in which the next step is possible. On the other hand, in the examples we've talked about, Armenia, Azerbaijan, the situation with Israel and Gaza, um, we've seen we've seen that kind of first step, but it's clear that there is so much more work to be done to actually establish that durable peace. Um,
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that um, it's very hard to do what we in foreign policy work call compellence. It's a lot easier to stop people from starting something. It's a lot harder to reverse what they already started. And that is one of the reasons why it's very hard to get to a peace, especially if the costs, both material and in terms of human sacrifice and blood component increased, right? Because it's very hard to walk back from there. So long durable peace is a hard thing. And not always, killing, stopping the killing right away, hoping that it will not start, is not always the right strategy. I don't want to sort of go back to, like everybody sort of highlights when we talk about these things, the Second World War. But there's a reason why it's the classic example. If there was a deal back done in 1940 in order to stop the killing in Europe, or the push by the Nazi Germany, if US or Britain end up making that deal, I'm not particularly sure that particular future would end up means less suffering at the end.
Yeah.
So I think, I although I understand the impulse to say that, look, we gotta stop this, we gotta stop people killing each other, that may end up resulting in a cumulative sense, a lot more suffering and death if the conditions are not right for the parties to come to a just peace. And in many of the conflicts today, we see that, right? What are those conditions? There are multiple of them. One of them is, of course, overwhelming victory of one side over the other. Then you can actually impose a particular peace.
Yeah.
And if you are engaging in an enlightened self-interest, you try to have even the imposed peace being more just, because you don't want resentment and division and
Yeah.
and all that coming back. But in most cases, the parties are so far away from each other in terms of what they want to achieve and what they believe they can achieve, that stopping the war by forcing them to stop the war would only enable the parties to regroup, reassess what resources they have, and then engage. Now, there's always the possibility of, once you stop the killing, there might be groups coming up within each country, for example, that will push for the maintenance of that peace,
Yeah.
because people can go back to their lives and produce and trade and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But then that's where you cannot sort of engage in generalizations, but need to look at each warring party and their specific political socioeconomic conditions to see whether there are any groups that can actually advocate for doing by practice, right? Let's stop. We may not believe in this, but let's try and see whether we can get to it. So it will then depend on the specific conflict and whether there are any constituents in those countries that would actually are strong enough, vocal enough, and have enough leverage and influence over the decision making to say that we stopped, let's not restart. And that's a question, again, going back to the political judgment of the parties that are involved, and it will be different from one conflict to another.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. That these things don't lend themselves to like very black and white, hard and fast rules. And I know you've got a lot of expertise on Ukraine, Russia specifically, and I want to drill down into that. And I think yeah, there's a lot to explore in terms of those that reflexively say, wouldn't it be better to just have peace? But then those who raise the concern, on the other hand, of whether a short-term peace will actually lead to less human suffering. Let me just, before we go to that, ask you to kind of apply the frame you're talking about to some of the deals that have already been made. For example, Gaza, right now, post ceasefire. Do you think the conditions are such that the existence of a ceasefire allows actors that are not Hamas to be able to say, hey, we need we want to prevent the restart of any kind of conflict. We want to see changes in our approach, changes in our governance. Do you see there being new kinds of politics emerging on the Israeli side following the ceasefire, or is the most likely follow up to this just like the lines continue to be drawn and something sets it off again?
Let me just preface by saying that I'm not a Middle East expert, so my look at this particular conflict will be from someone who works on war and conflict and see what kind of patterns we can identify. And when it comes to specifically this sort of post ceasefire situation in Gaza, I do see two things. Number one, uh, I cannot see a force within the Palestinian groups that can actually force out and force Hamas to lay their arms, not being a terrorist organization, and not target both the other Palestinians as well as, of course, Israelis. Um, is there any force within that community that can take over? I cannot see any, and their immediate assault on those who were fighting against Hamas in Gaza by the Palestinian groups that are confronting Hamas right after the ceasefire was to target them. Right, Hamas targeted them, killed them, executed them,
Yeah.
and all that to reassert its power in the region. Yes, it is. It's very much weakened. A lot of its leadership cadres were killed, etc. But I'm not particularly sure that was possible, because there is no alternative sort of form of authority to take over, and I cannot see any sort of international, be it coalition of Muslim countries or something else that is willing to step into an enforcement role that would marginalize and eventually disarm Hamas in the region, which means you have an armed terrorist organization, however weakened, would continue to hold sway in the region. Now, that is, of course, from the Israeli side, it has to be whether is this a manageable risk? Can we go back to the policies we had before, mowing the lawn and all that other components that limits the risk of another October 7 attack, but without necessarily having a full scale invasion, occupation, and operation going on in Gaza, which is not necessarily particularly popular at this stage in Israel as well. So it's a very fragile component because I cannot. Hamas didn't change its genocidal goal of eliminating Israel and driving all the Jews out of the Middle East. So and they maintain a source of power. Now, how to deal with that is the question. On the Israeli side, that is the judgment that needs to be done. To me, again, from looking outside, I do see the probability of the resumption of a full-scale, large-scale operation in Gaza is decreasing. There's not much domestic political appetite. The momentum of that is gone. This is one of the cases where it stops. It might be easier to maintain that status quo rather than restarting it. But there will be, of course, as we see over the weeks as well, there will be Israel will defend itself and will target Hamas and others in the region in order to manage that risk because it is not acceptable.
Yeah. So what you're describing essentially is a return to the political layout that existed prior to October 7th, which like it's an open question again that the killing has stopped, but this is where it is. And to your point, I mean, I do want to highlight there has been an anti-Hamas, we want to live movement in Gaza among Palestinians, very, very heroic people, but brutally suppressed as well. And I guess to just generalize it out from the Middle East, like it does underline the point that if you want peace, you have to have some kind of a vision for what peace is going to look like, right? If you say, "Okay, we want to have peace," well, okay, in that peace, who's going to be governing what, and is there the existence of that alternative? So like it's easier to ask these questions than to provide answers. But
Yes.
if you want peace, you've got to sort of articulate like, okay, well, what's it going to look like then, and how are we going to get there? And it includes or maybe starts with, maybe includes a stopping of conflict, but what happens next, and what's the vision of where things are going to land, so that you have justice and peace that is durable, not just a reprieve and then renewal of conflict.
I mean, you can have a situation of non-war or non-conflict, but that doesn't necessarily equate into peace. right? In my understanding, you can have a status quo or an imposition. I mean, as the saying goes, enemies would love to have peace. If you surrender and
Yeah,
give up, and that won't be war. And but that is not the peace that we think when we think about peace, right? We think about
totally.
dignity, we think about security, prosperity, etc.
Yeah.
And that is extremely hard to reach.
Yeah, Ronald Reagan's iconic "time for choosing" speech. You can have peace and you can have it in the next second, but there's only one sure way to have peace, and that's through surrender. And the speech goes on, as you know. So let's talk about Ukraine. This is your sharp area of expertise here, and I know you and I are both sort of deeply invested in the moral justness of the Ukrainian cause. But before we get to that, let's talk sort of in just a sort of very practical sense. What are the factors that have led to Ukraine not having a peace deal yet, as we've seen these deals in
Uh,
other places?
Uh, the the short answer is that there is no change in Russia's objectives, and because there is no change, there is no incentive for Ukraine to agree to the terms for
Just on
Russia.
that, how would you describe Russia's real objectives? Not I mean, not their stated objectives, but what do you think their real objectives are right now?
The primary objective, and this is sort of a nested objective in essence, is the complete vassalization of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin would have preferred this through subversion, bribery, coercion, rather than full-scale invasion, which they have been trying to do in the past, 10, 12 years, going back to even 2008 with the Georgia war. But that particular objective didn't change, right? Ukraine that is under the yoke in that one sense, although nominally, independent, was basically another Belarus,
Right.
right? That particular way is for Vladimir Putin, and not only for Putin himself, but also the broader Russian political and security elite, is the ticket for Russia to reassert itself as a great power in Europe, right? As a famous geopolitical analyst and a former national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, said that with Ukraine, Russia is an empire. Without Ukraine, it's not, right. So that became the component. So territory, in that sense, is secondary. Territory, control of Donbass or elsewhere, is a means of political pressure and political control in Kiev, in Ukraine, in order to ensure that Ukraine remains a vassal state. So that particular political objective did not change. And that, of course, is not acceptable to Ukrainians because they do know and they saw what it means. They continue to every day see what it means to live under the Russian yoke. They do see what's going on in Mariupol. They do see in other occupied territories the efforts to erase Ukrainian identity, language, from the kidnapping of children to indoctrinate them and all that stuff. So they do know that what that peace would look like. So that is, of course, not an acceptable choice for Ukrainians
Yeah.
too, and thus that doesn't change.
Yeah. So that's really interesting because I mean there's some suggestion that there's been a shift from an effort to towards vassalization to simply territorial acquisition. If the goal is the vassalization of Ukraine, it seems to me that the only way to achieve that um, is through regime change in Kyiv, the end of Ukrainian democracy, and and that objective seems to be moving further and further away as Ukraine unites in opposition to this invasion. My impression is that not just since the full scale invasion, but since the initial invasion of Crimea, there has been sort of this trajectory in Ukrainian identity of real kind of consolidation of Ukrainian identity in response to that invasion. And prior to that invasion, it might have been easier for the Russian state to try to appeal to hearts and minds to some extent, but their ability to do that is so dramatically in decline. So how is it conceivable in light of that, in light of how their own activities are pushing away their, what you describe as their objectives? Um, how is it conceivable that they would achieve their aims um, short of turning Ukraine into a directly controlled military dictatorship?
For Putin, if that's the way to go, that's the way to go. The the underlying component that I think you laid out very perfectly, in the sense that how um, particularly Crimea since 2014 and onwards, and Putin and Russia's reactions, and the way they do things, consolidated the Ukrainian national identity. Right after the start of the full scale invasion of war, I also said at some point that Vladimir Putin is also the true father of German rearmament in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
He achieves that too. So uh, uh, the the way, when you look at it from a interest perspective, and you say, if this is the objective, how come he's doing these things that actually push the objective farther away?
Yeah.
But if you try to sort of have his perspective, there is a deep set bigotry. This is not only Putin, but also some broader Russian intelligentsia and the security services that cannot come to accept the fact that Ukraine and Ukrainians is a distinct, separate identity, and they all. You keep hearing this again and again. It's like, oh, they are confused Russians. There's the whole thing about there's Russia, there is Belarus, and then there is the Mala Russia, which is like sort of Ukraine, the little
Mm-hmm.
Russians. It's always that approach of condescension, right? And if they need to be thought by beating them up, we'll do that by beating them up. History of Russia and the Soviet Union is filled with forced assimilation, deportations, ethnic cleansing. So that is not necessarily anything new from the Russian strategic culture perspective. Well, if they don't want to accept that they are actually Russians, we will beat until the morale improves, right?
Right.
We will beat this into them. Because to them, the alternative is they accept that Russia is a normal country. It's no longer an empire that has a right to rule over other peoples. And that goes into a very deep sense of Russian imperial identity. So I totally agree. I mean, the only way to sort of have that control over Ukraine is through a brutal dictatorship
Yeah.
and control.
Because
And Putin's
isn't it true as a general rule that vassalization or empire requires
local elites to work
it
with you.
requires, yeah, exactly, like some degree of acquiescence. Like, not
Yes.
I'm not suggesting consent or anything, but if you have people that are um, just aggressively, sharply motivated to resist the occupier with everything they have, it becomes extremely costly and expensive for that occupation to continue, versus a reality, yeah, in which there is some level of acquiescence from the majority of people to a certain reality. So, like, what you're describing is Russian war aims uh, that uh, require some level of acquiescence, um,
Yes.
and
And that's not forthcoming.
that's
And
exactly.
right, so then you end up in a position where, what is their calculation, right? And Putin's calculation is that Ukraine and the West will tire before we do. Yes, it's costly. Yes, and they might not like it, and they will grumble. And yes, that will be a regular sort of guerrilla attacks and maybe subversion and everything else
Yeah.
in certain parts of the country. But we can manage that because we can impose a sense of indifference, a sense of tiredness on the population in Ukraine, as well as the Europeans, saying that, fine, it's just I can't do this anymore. Right? That sort of indifference is is the way that Russians want to rule, because that's how Putin actually also rules within Russia. It's not so much that people, especially at this stage, that they love him. It's more about the resignation, the indifference component, the apathy that he wants to sort of bring in, and he wants to do that in Ukraine. If that cannot be achieved, and this is, I think, where sort of the bigotry component really comes in. If that cannot be achieved, it's like the sort of the psycho boyfriend. If I can't have you, no one can, right? So if I cannot have this control, I will destroy Ukraine, its culture, its cities, its potential, to the degree that they cannot be the independent, prosperous, nation that they hope to be. So if I can't have you, no one can, including yourself, right? And that sort of vindictive approach is what we also see across occupied territories, as well as regular attacks on civilians by Kremlin. But he believes that the cost of doing this for his regime is not high enough. It's not survival level for him to worry about it. Yes, it's costly, but he thinks he can outlast both Ukraine and the West, and it is bearable. Our job is, of course, should make sure that that cost is unbearable for Kremlin, because that's the only way to change the behavior.
Right. So it seems, based on what you're describing, that there is a misunderstanding then among some of the would-be peacemakers in other places, who suppose that Putin's objectives are more defined by territorial gains, especially areas where there's a larger portion of Russian speakers. That they would imagine that what he wants is to be able to establish in a firmer way Russian control over the presently occupied territories. If that's the goal, then then the transactional approach, the purely transactional approach, might yield some kind of transactional end to the war that says the line will be here and not there. If you're talking about where the line is, this is sort of thing that again, putting aside the morality piece, could be kind of discussed at a transactional level. But if, as you've described, that's a wrong understanding of Russian war aims. If Russian war aims are necessarily about vassalization of Ukraine, not about territorial gains, then this is just completely barking up the wrong tree.
Yes, I think that is the case, and one of the reasons why I think is such is that Putin could have annexed the Donbass, the parts of eastern Ukraine that they invaded after 2014 at any moment, right? They did not even recognize the so-called puppet regimes there, people's republics, up until in the eve of the full-scale invasion. So if the purpose was territory, you want to do that as you do with Crimea, right? In the case of Crimea, I do think that it is at least partially about the territory. But when you think about Donbass, it could have been done in the exact same way that they forced to do in Crimea. Go invade fake republic, and then a plebiscite next day, and then hurrah, we just annexed it. It could have been done at any moment from 2014 to 2022. It was not done, and especially right now in the past 3.5 years. What are you going to do with the particular territory? The war primarily takes in that region, right? It's heavily depopulated, destroyed beyond recognition in most cases in the front lines. Most of the population either left if they are sort of loyal to Ukraine, or are already being killed in the fields because they heavily recruited in the region to fight their war, etc., etc. What are you going to do with that the place that requires huge investments and rebuilding and a constant suppression of any sense of Ukrainian identity that draws resources from everything else? I cannot see both the strategic logic and the political logic of saying that, all we want is Donbass, so we're just going to take it and move on, because there is nothing that actually brings, neither politically nor economically nor even psychologically, to the Russian regime, and therefore to me, it's a red herring. It's about, oh, let's agree with this. Let me take this part. It's about, heads I win, tails you lose, right? What is mine, what is yours is negotiable. We take it, we'll build up, we'll reconstitute. Ukrainians already, are tired with the war. They don't. If we can impose it, we can start the creeping invasion again. We can restart it again. So it is more about having creating a situation on the ground that would strengthen their position, so that they can come back a year, 6 months, 2 years down the road to finish the job in their minds. So focusing on the territorial component is, I think, missing the whole Russian actions and their own statements about what they care about, right? Vassalization of Ukraine is about Russian strategic culture, about its self-image, but it is also, in their mind, a way to reassert Russia as a great power in Europe, as someone they need to listen to. And you can't do that by just Donbass, right?
Yeah.
If it is not, why did you lose 1 million people? Right. So that's very hard to explain as well.
Yeah, and just supporting your assessment of this is the fact that when the further invasion started, they struck for Kyiv, right? Like that was the goal. It was, and some people might dispute, okay, that might have been the goal at the beginning, but what could the goal evolve into? And I guess this is another question about kind of the road to potential peace, which is if the Russian calculation changes at some point because the Putin regime decides in a crass self-interested way, but just that the cost is too high for their regime, that there comes to be some kind of an internal response, and then how do we create the conditions in which that reevaluation happens on the Russian side, and what might be the indicators that we're there? Some might argue that we may be getting there now, where the Russian regime is prepared to shift from a vassalization approach to a territorial acquisition approach, just for a face-saving way to say, basically, we can't achieve the objective we wanted to anymore.
That's the $64,000 question, and it is very hard to do, and that's one of the reasons why I tend to be sort of pessimistic about the possibility of war ending anytime soon. The only way to do it, as you highlighted, is to change the political calculus in Kremlin, and how you do that is similar to any other engagement. You hit where it hurts, right? You need to find a leverage point. It's clear at this stage that killing more Russian soldiers is not going to change much, at least now. In the midterm to long term, yes, they're a big country, but they're not unlimited supply of young men to go and die. But so far, they are, right. Every a month, 33 to 35,000 new volunteers sign up. People need to sort of remember that the people who are fighting in Ukraine for Russia are not conscripts. These are not 18-year-olds that are forced or gang pressed to go and fight. These people volunteer. They sign up. They're contract soldiers. And every month, it's about 33 to 35,000 new shows up.
In so terms of those volunteers, isn't a big factor sort of, poverty and intensive economic coercion, like
it's incentives rather than coercion, right? Okay. They are being offered significant amounts of money if they get killed, and their families get it, and et cetera, but it doesn't necessarily sort of change the fundamental moral calculus that those people need to make, and that is, do I want to sign up to get, I don't know, 1 million rubles to go and kill Ukrainians? And they choose to do that. And there is no necessarily, seems so far, no need to sort of bring in the conscripts and so on and so forth. Now, it might change in the future because, like I said, there's no unlimited amount of people that you can send as cannon fodder to the region. But one way, so far in the short to medium term, that's not going to change. So that's not the way to do it. Some people talk about finances and targeting. I don't think Putin per se cares about the money part of it. He believes in the power, and power can get you money. and that has been the mindset of the security services in Russia. The whole famous like literal corporate raids where in 90s and in 2000s where thugs would go into companies, put a gun to their head, sign that over, and take it. Right. So it's not so much can we target the oligarchs and get their money out, and that's not going to work. The only way I would say to do is to make sure that they can no longer continue to fund the war, because fundamentally it's about resources.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there's a lot of, and I wrote about this with Russia-China cooperation and access and so on and so forth. But those guys are not necessarily liking each other. They hate us more than they like each other, so that's why they work together. But for example, Chinese are driving a hard bargain. If they can't give money, they're not getting anything from the Chinese. They're not getting anything from the North Koreans, Iranians. The same story. They need to be able to give something to them to get that support. And that something comes primarily through the Russian hydrocarbon exports, oil and gas.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this has we wrote about this at MLI. You have talked about this, and your colleagues have talked about this again and again. One of the biggest mistakes that Canada did, and we failed our allies, is not to get our energy, our LNG, particularly to our European allies, to cut that off, to reduce their reliance on Russian gas and further down to oil. So you have to really cut down the revenues. Now that will take time to have an impact on the budget and the functioning of the economy, etc., etc. The second thing that needs to be done, and this is pretty much controversial, is we need to make what I occasionally call make subversion great again, in the sense that we need to target the sinews of Russian state power within their society, enabling Ukrainians to target further their critical infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, but also through information operations in the region, through a bunch of other activities to undermine the trust, and the confidence of the Russian people in Kremlin's capability and ability to deliver. Right. So we need to find ways to undermine their power structures, cut off their revenue, undermine their power structures through subversion, as well as through enabling Ukrainians to target further and further into where it hurts the Russians, which is going to be the energy infrastructure and elsewhere, in order to force Putin to look around himself and say that, okay, will there be somebody who's willing to take me out because things are getting tough here? And what can I do to prevent that? I don't think he is feeling that right now. I don't think he has that concern right now. We, in this sense, need to make him concerned that if he continues the war, his rule, and in addition to that, of course, his life is at jeopardy, and he does not feel that. We need to find ways to do that, and of course, it's easier said than done.
Yeah. So, thank you for sharing that in detail. One question to consider is, to what extent can some of these things, obviously not all of them, but some of these things, be done under the conditions of a ceasefire? So if we had short-term peace, in which neither side achieved their fundamental objectives, parts of Ukraine remained occupied, but Ukraine was not vassalized. You could imagine circumstances in which we maintained our resolve to fight with the Russian state by other means, and continued to, and were more aggressive in targeting their economic lifeblood in ways that made the Putin regime still more unstable, and that threatened and that undermined their economic capacity to re-engage the war. Do you think that some of these things could be done, would be done under the conditions of a ceasefire, or are the conditions of war necessary for these other activities to bring about a change or reevaluation of objectives by Putin?
I mean, why would Russians agree on that particular ceasefire then, right? I mean, if we actually ramp up the pressure as a result of ceasefire. They can break the ceasefire, assuming that they ever agree to it. But again, if they think they are not losing, that is, and they can sustain this longer than the Ukraine and the West, why would they agree to it? And when they do agree to it, that will come with conditions. And if we force them to a ceasefire and then ramp up our undermining of the regime, they can break the ceasefire. So I cannot see a reason why Kremlin, looking at our efforts to choke their oil and gas exports and undermine their authority within Russia, and said, okay, I'm going to continue to keep the ceasefire. Right. So I don't necessarily see that why they would agree to it if they think they are not losing at this stage. And if they do agree to it, that would come with, okay, sanctions relief. You don't do this, you don't do that. And if you do, I restart this, the whole thing. I mean, I know that, people, we don't want necessarily war. Ukrainians for sure don't want war.
Yeah.
But it takes two to tango, right? So,
Yeah.
Unfortunate reality is that this war will last at least another year, and then we'll see afterwards. And we, just because we don't want it doesn't mean that we'll get to a ceasefire we want. So we need to think about how to push Kremlin to, not out of goodwill or anything else, but pure self-preservation, to say that, okay, now it's hitting home. And one needs to remember, Vladimir Putin is not an irrational, reckless guy. Throughout his political career, he has been, in most cases, deferred decision making on hard things, and he has been quite cautious. The reason why he went in 2022 is not because he was reckless or risk taking. He believed that it would be a walk in the park. That's why they sent the National Guard with, crowd control mechanisms. That's what his intelligence services told him, that they spent $10 billion and we both, everybody will just walk in, and his own image of Ukrainians as this, they are little Russians, they don't know anything, they are peasants, will take over, they'll, just obey what we tell them. And plus, what the West would do. In 2008, we invaded Georgia, they did nothing. 2014, we took over Crimea, invaded eastern Ukraine, the West did nothing. We bombed civilians in 2015 in Syria, they did nothing. 2016, Libya, they did nothing. Why would they do something different now, right? We just signed, Nord Stream 2. The Europeans won't do anything. Americans won't do anything. It's going to be walk in the park, right? So he went in because he thought the cost will be very, very low. So this is a guy who sits 20 meters away from everybody throughout COVID. If you want to see him, you had to spend 2 weeks in isolation before you meet him, right? All that stuff. So this is not a guy that is willing to take big risks. The idea is that he does not feel threatened. He doesn't feel that his power is threatened. He feels that if he stops right now, where the economy is very much war-driven, there is a whole new set of constituencies and interest groups that emerge because of the war, that he will be vulnerable if he's perceived as not fulfilling this whole beast that he created, in one sense, this whole nationalistic, imperialistic Russia, bringing it back up. He cannot get off the tiger, right? So one needs to understand that he does not feel threatened. And the moments he feels threatened, this is a guy that takes a step back. It's a very Bolshevik thing, right?
Yeah.
Probe with bayonets, you meet mush, you go through, you meet still, you pull back. So unless he feels that his regime and his life and his legacy in his mind is under threat, he has no reason to change tack.
Right. Thank you. It's sobering but important that you share these insights. So the pursuit of peace in this case must involve attacking the economic capacity and, more broadly, the capacity of the Russian state to wage war. And they're not limited by fighting men, but they're limited in terms of the economic capacity, or could be limited. And this underlines a message that especially our party's been pushing since the start of the war, which is, the importance of supporting Ukraine. And part of that support for Ukraine means having a Canadian economic development strategy that recognizes our unique vocation in the world as the free democracy with an incredible abundance of natural resources that can displace and replace Russian exports. Balkan, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you. This has been a really good discussion. Let me conclude on a more sort of speculative point. So, I mean, at the end of the Cold War, there would have been hope that Russia could have been brought into the community of free nations. Where we're at right now, which you're describing, is a sort of a set of values defined objectives that is not about the well-being of the Russian people, that is all about kind of a particular vision of Russia's power projection rooted in historical nostalgia. How did we get here? Were there other paths not taken, and what can we learn about um, learn from that about what could be a possible future where a just peace at the end of this conflict could presage not only peace and security for Ukraine, but something different for the Russian people.
I mean, as you know, history is multicausal, and there are a bunch of reasons why we end up here, including what we did, what the Russians did, and so on and so forth throughout 1990s. But I think the fundamental lesson, one of the most important things, when we look at history and how Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, for example, after the defeat, those countries are reformed. The fundamental component there lays in the fact that the not only sort of the people who caused that destruction and death were, at least to a limited extent, brought to justice, but there was a fundamental shift in the strategic culture of those countries that no longer sees their role and their prestige through the domination of others. Right. In the case of Japan and Germany, both of them, the hierarchy of prestige shifted to science and technology and being excellent in the production of these things rather than control and domination, right? And that was only possible through a thorough discrediting of the previous regime and the regimes that actually came before them, that fed that the notion that in order to be a great power, you need to control things, and that we never had that with Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons is what I would call, Cheka is one of the names of KGB, their intelligence services. They got multiple names across the 20th century. And they call themselves Chekists still, Vladimir Putin and others who work for the intelligence services. We never had a de-Chekistification in the Soviet Union after the collapse of the Soviet Union and Russia, like we had with the denazification or holding the Imperial Japan accountable in the same way. So what happened was that the people the security elite who is wounded after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but never sort of either brought to justice in the sense that what they did, or a broader reckoning of the crimes of Soviet Union and what that means for Russian culture. So what end up having is that after the 1990s, the whole turmoil. Whenever the moment they have the opportunity, because of rising oil prices and everything else, that group of intelligence and security services, what they call Sloviki, managed to take power again, and then they feel had their resources, so they went for being a revisionist power once again. So without having that broader change in strategic culture in Russia, Russia would continue to remain a chronic threat to peace and stability in the region. Without that change, as we saw in other cases like in Japan and Germany, we will come back in this cycle again and again, because it is not only about Vladimir Putin. It is a broader understanding of Russia's place in the world and what that place means. And as long as it is reliant on controlling and dominating others around, that's the way they see their greatness, we will continue to have this problem.
Okay, I'm gonna actually throw in one more question if that's okay, because what you said was really interesting, and I think the comparison to history, what you had with Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, is total defeat. And as you rightly said, I mean, if there were voices, I mean, there were voices calling for kind of peace, accommodation in the early phases of the Second World War. If that had happened, there likely would have been more suffering over the course of history. But um, because you had total defeat, denazification, and this change in the hierarchy of prestige. People still compete for success, but they compete in other ways. They compete to be excellent in business and science and politics. They don't compete to be through the domination of other powers. That change followed a complete defeat. Now, we are now living in a nuclear age, right? In an age where powers like Russia and North Korea have a kind of ultimate insurance against the sort of total defeat that that led to the dramatic reorientations of society that we saw in Germany and Japan. Um, what
So
what should
yeah,
what
so
should
that
our
that
war aims be in light of that? Like what are realistic objectives for us in this new reality?
so I mean, in that sense, yeah, exactly right. In a nuclear age, a total defeat of a great power like Russia that has the world's largest nuclear arsenal is out of the question, right? So, and without having that total defeat, you cannot impose such a cultural change from outside, which needs to come from inside. Which means it's a very long process. Russia, in that sense, is a generational challenge. One of the things that I, over the years that I try to sort of get across to the public is that we need to be ready for a generational 20, 25-year confrontation with Russia. It might have ups and downs. It doesn't mean a constant war all the time. This particular war will come to an end at some point, but that doesn't mean that our problems with Russia or the Russia that poses a problem and a threat to peace and stability in the transatlantic area is over, because we cannot impose something from outside. It has to come from inside. And that can only happen through either the gradual corrosion and corruption and rotting of the system, in which then alternatives can emerge, sometimes good, sometimes worse. And that might lead to something else. But also, to be frank, it's also a demographics issue, right? It's also the generation, Putin's generation and one younger dude that remembers the whole sort of great power component will die off eventually. Now it will take 20 years, 25 years, but the new ones that are coming up, they grow up in 90s and early 2000s with travel to Europe, with all the luxuries and the prosperity and the openness. They will not necessarily have the same nostalgia of that control. Now, I might be wrong, and they might actually end up having a much more indoctrinated, um, youth that takes over. But again, that doesn't necessarily change the dynamic that it will be a very tough and long road, because it cannot be imposed from outside. All we can do is to contain and push back and wait for that system and Russians themselves to realize that if they want a prosperous, secure, fulfilling lives, it does not go through by the control and domination of others, and that will take time. And we just have to admit the fact that we may want to go back and get back to business and be all these nice things, but unfortunately, that is not going to be the case. So we have to be cognizant of the fact that this is going to be a long haul thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in that context, it's worth reminding ourselves, coming back to this point about peace and war, right? That there's no such thing as the end of history. that the pursuit of peace is not a something that once done is complete forever. It is a continuing, reoccurring, ongoing effort that will always be with us. So,
Absolutely.
on that cheery note, Balkan, thanks for a really good, substantial conversation. I'm so glad we had you on. And once again, today being Remembrance Day, at least the day we release this, it's it's important for us to be within the safety of Canada having these conversations, but it is the courageous men and women in uniform on the front lines, Ukrainian soldiers who are defending their freedom and ours, also Canadian soldiers who are involved in training and supporting those brave Ukrainians, Canadians in Latvia as part of our reassurance efforts. So I want to again end as I started by thanking those who sacrifice for our peace and our freedom. And thank you again, Balkan. So we'll be back with another episode of Resuming Debate in 14 days. You can get these episodes everywhere you get your podcast, as well as on YouTube. Please like, share, and leave a review. And as I said, we'll be back with another episode in 2 weeks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Garnet. It's a pleasure.